дошли в Генератор. Аз съм Бояна, част от екипа на Генератор и част от кураторския колектив Студио Комплект. Много се радвам на огромния интерес за днешната лекция. Ние от години искаме Деян Суджич да е наш гост тук в България и да изнесе лекция, така че сме изключително щастливи, че най-накрая това се случва. Генератор е център за дизайн и иновации. Стартирахме миналия юли и от тогава всъщност правим съдържание, с което искаме да покажем колко е важен дизайнът днес и дизайн из форматът, в рамките на който Деян Суджич е наш гост, цели именно това да ви запознае с различни новатори в сферата на дизайна. Благодарение на Ауди, нашите партньори, това е възможно да се случи. Днес на петото издание Деян Суджич да е наш гост. Имам удоволствието да поканя при мен Преслава Владимирова, която е маркетинг менеджер на Ауди.
Здравейте и от мен. Изключително сме щастливи, че можем да подкрепим това събитие. Ауди е партньор на международни събития, свързани с дизайна, като Дизайн Майами. Участваме като титулярен спонсор и в седмицата на дизайна в Милано. И поради това сме щастливи винаги, когато имаме възможност да посредничим в диалога на дизайна с публиката. Защото автомобилният дизайн всъщност в есенцията си е диалог и комбинация в съчетанието на функционалност и естетика. И функционалността и естетиката са залогът за един непреходен дизайн, по думите на Марк Лихте, който е главният дизайнер на Ауди. Моделът, с който партнираме на събитието, е А7, защото той е есенцията на съвременния дизайнерски прочит на марката за линия, функционалност и естетика. И заради това се чувстваме в елемента си в лекция на тема Бъдещето на дизайна, това, което е и А7 за марката. Характеристиките на дизайна на А7 ще видите във всички премиери, които предстоят за марката в световен мащаб от тук насетне. Пожелавам ви приятно слушане.
Последни думи, преди да поканя господин Суджич на сцената. Здравейте от мен, аз съм Адриана, другата част от Студио Комплект. Историята за неговото идване, както спомена и Бояна, е много дълга и нашето желание да го привлечем тук на място беше малко и шанс, както нещата се случват в живота. Винаги трябва да имаш и малко късмет. Всъщност двамата с господин Суджич пътувахме в един автобус в Швеция на едно специално събитие, организирано миналата година в Икея. И така се случи разговорът за София, за България и когато го поканихме, вече през тази лична връзка стана наистина възможност това събитие, което за нас е огромна чест. Защо? Защото всъщност дизайнът като обяснение има най-различни прочити и господин Суджич в ролята си на директор на дизайн музея може би е най-правилният човек да отправи третировка на тази тема, защото в неговата отговорност е не само да подбира обекти, които ще останат в историята ни, като свидетелство за това, което се е случило в света в този момент, но също така и отговорност да ни образова какво е ценно, какво е важно, какво всъщност променя живота ни и защо дизайнът е тема, за която трябва да говорим. За мен е изключителна чест да го поканя на сцената, за да ни разкаже какво ще е бъдещето на дизайна според Дизайн музей и неговия прочит.
Thank you, Generator. Thank you, Audi. I have some bad news. I'm going to be speaking in English. So anyone who wants their money back should leave now. In case you're wondering, this image is in fact the roof of the new Design Museum in London. It's a 60s landmark, which we turned into the new home for the Design Museum, which opened 16 months ago. And since that, we've had more than 1 million visitors who've come to see us. And in a way, that is really what I'm here to talk about, and something that I've spent most of my career thinking about. The idea that design is much too important only to be something which is thought about and talked about by people like us, by architects who wear black, like myself, Japanese suits. I trained to be an architect, but I very quickly discovered that I was both incompetent, not very good, and impatient, which is exactly the two things you should not be if you're an architect. But I have managed, after that early realization, as Clint Eastwood said so correctly, it's important to know your limitations. I've been lucky enough to spend my life thinking about design, looking at it, talking about it, writing about it, and now at the Design Museum trying to make a program which does suggest that design is part of the wider culture, that it's not only about, it's not only there for those who do it, but it's also, for me, design is a way to understand the world around us, and design is something whose shape has kept on changing. When the Design Museum first opened in a much smaller building in the 1980s, you could have told the story of design through a selection of well-chosen chairs, which might start with bentwood tonnet, which was, you could say, the first industrially produced chair, which did for the craft of making chairs what McDonald's did for the art of cuisine, de-skilling it, but making something that was cheap and beautiful for many people. And then you would probably look at a tubular steel chair from the Bauhaus, and then maybe something wooden from Alvar Aalto, and then something plastic from Finland, etc., etc. But now design is about so many other things than the chair. Of course, our audiences love chairs. They want to see them. But we're talking about a non-physical world, a world of pixels and the digital explosion as well. So design is about different things. There'll be 3 sections to my talk today. First of all, I want to talk a little bit about design as a language, trying to deal with some of those misconceptions about good design, quote unquote, that design is not only about taste, and design is not only about utility and function, but it's also about emotions. Then I want to talk a little bit about where design, as I see it, is moving. And then finally, to talk about what the museum is doing. So it's always good to start with money. I think design in the modern sense begins with the Industrial Revolution, when there was a disconnection for the first time between the craftsman and the user, and the machine meant that there was a role for a designer who got in the way of those two. And that is one of the reasons that people sometimes see design as only being about money and commerce, and of course it is that, but to me it's also about culture. And for some people design is too commercial, it's persuading us to buy stuff that we don't need. Other kinds of design are asking us to ask questions about what is happening to the world. But I love this image because of course it's showing how design is a wonderful trick, because here the graphic designer has turned a completely worthless rectangle of paper into something which is worth $100. And how have they done that? Well, it's green. We know that green is the color of money. And we know that it's expensive because someone has spent a long time with these very elaborate engravings around the edge, which sort of suggest something to do with Cuban cigar boxes, but also a sign of money. And it's always illustrated by men, usually with unnecessary amounts of facial hair. My family come from ex-Yugoslavia, but I was born in London. But I can remember being pretty puzzled when I first realized that when we went back to Yugoslavia for our summer holidays, banknotes there, the dinar was decorated not with the Queen's head, which is what money is about, but with pictures of steel workers and factory workers and blast furnaces and happy workers and peasants. And then a bit later on, when the Soviet Union collapsed and Eastern Europe emerged from communism, one suddenly saw these new states emerging from Yugoslavia. And even before Slovenia or Croatia had an army, they had banknotes. And to become forward-looking, they abandoned the workers and the peasants, and they went back to 18th century philosophers. The Croats made their krona look as much like the Deutschmark as possible, and the Slovenes put Josip Plečnik on the back of their banknotes, and very beautiful it was too. And then, of course, the euro. It's artificial money. The very name euro sounds like some kind of what shall I say, insecticide, something that actually keeps the crops safe. There was a not very well remembered British Prime Minister called John Major, who did have one really good idea. He didn't want to call it the euro, he wanted to call it the florin, which of course has a long history in Europe. The British used to have a coin called the florin. The Dutch used it for the guilder. It came from Florence, which was a sign of banking. A nice organic idea, but no, it had to be the euro. And of course, the symbolism of the euro is fascinating. It's clear that it's designed by someone who believes in progress, and the symbolism is all about collaboration and connection. Every banknote has a range of doors, bridges, and windows, which are about opening barriers, I guess. And of course, also they have to be non-specific doors, bridges, and windows, because you can't afford to offend any member state, so they can't be an Italian one or a German one, they're generic. And it's also designed by someone who believes in progress, because the lowest value euro has the oldest images of Greek and Roman doors, bridges and windows, whereas the high value 500 euro drug smuggler's delight has plate glass windows from an office building in Brussels. But the Swiss, everyone knows that Swiss money is valuable, so they don't need to bother about all that stuff. They can actually have entirely abstract ideas of banknotes because we know that the Swiss are safe. They can even risk putting Le Corbusier on the back of the 10-franc note. So that's a starting point about what do we mean by utility and function. There's so many other messages that design can convey. And you find the same thing going on in something which is apparently the most functional thing of all, which is military camouflage, whose job, of course, is to make your soldiers completely invisible. And yet, each nation state has its own camouflage, so that they're completely invisible in an American, British, Syrian, desert camouflage America. So this stuff is actually, again, apparently a functional utilitarian thing, but it's actually using design and technique to do rather different things than what we think of as function in its usual sense. Oh, this amazing image, which takes us back to the days when there still was a Soviet Union, and this photograph, well, it's not a photograph, this illustration is actually realized in the Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C., where the American and Soviet capsules that docked in Earth orbit now hang in the museum. And again, you would think that nothing is more functionally demanding than getting a satellite out of gravity into orbit. Nothing is there for superfluous purposes. And yet, we immediately know which half is American and which half is from the Soviet Union. The American half looks as though it was designed by a car designer from Detroit in the days of high-rise fins. And the Soviet half sort of suggests Jules Verne with a brass porthole and possibly a dentist's chair inside to sit on. Cars, I mean, I'm sorry, Audi, but no Audis today. But here we're looking at the way that what is apparently an engineering problem, how to make a cheap car, the de Chevaux, does somehow embody Frenchness. Is it because we've seen this so often that we think it's about France? Is it because Pierre Boulanger, the original engineer, set out to design something that was really aimed only at France? It was meant to be a cheap transport for farmers to take their stuff to market. Is it about French engineering skills, which have a particular way of working metal? Or is it just that it's become a sign of being French? Or this. This is a Bentley, which is supposedly about thoroughbred English motoring experience, that it's like a gentleman's club on wheels, that you shut the door with that click which only spells the sound of spending a lot of money on a car door, that inside you can smell the beautiful leather and there's walnut on the dashboard. This is about Englishness. And yet, of course, Bentley is now owned by a German manufacturer, and the design team was led by a Brazilian and a Belgian. And I think it also is showing us how car design has changed. When Henry Ford came up with the Model T, no one had designed a mass-produced car before. So the engineers and the design team were working on creating an entirely new type. Designing a car like this is much more like breeding rare sheep. They need a pedigree. Does it have its grandfather's ears or door handle? Do the lights suggest Bentleyness? So design in that sense has become a much more self-conscious, knowing trick, one might say. And one of the aspects of design is that ability to lovingly create the sense of authenticity and being real, and yet, of course, it's a fake. All sorts of apparently functional design issues can actually have extraordinary and unforeseen effects. This is a diagram made by a British electrical engineer called Harry Beck, who was working in the London Underground office in 1925, when the London Underground network was getting so complicated that no map was actually good enough to convey the sense of how you actually got around it. And he had this very wonderful intuitive idea that he could use the symbols from an electric circuit diagram to turn into a diagram to make sense of London's underground. And he produced this, which is a diagram, but it's actually got the river in it. And it's become the symbol of what London is. It's the way that Londoners identify themselves as much as the black taxis we have or the red telephone boxes. There was a curious Marxist interpretation of this map, because one of the things that he did for clarity was to space all the stations equally apart, which means in the middle you can actually read them, and they're much further apart than they really are in reality. But at the top of the map, you're actually making distances which are rather large seem much smaller. And yet, of course, in the 1930s, when this map came out, that was where the commercial house builders were building houses. So the vulgar Marxist interpretation is to say that this was a map designed to trick people into thinking their houses were much closer to the centre than they really were. And Beck was a real evangelist for what he did, so he tried several times to persuade Paris to take on this map, which they never did. The French never very keen on English exports. But the Vignellis in Manhattan sort of paid tribute with this wonderful fresh fruit salad diagram. This was actually made in the 1970s when New York was on the edge of going bankrupt, very high crime. The subway system was rotting away, but the one thing they could do was make the graphics look really good and fresh. And this is what that did. But of course, New Yorkers couldn't tell the difference between a map and a diagram. So they couldn't understand why Central Park up there, which they know is a rectangle, came out as a square. So it's been abandoned, and this is now turned into a classic, which you can download as an app, but it's no longer on the system. Architects and designers can sometimes get quite sniffy about fashion. Somehow it's seen as something slightly frivolous. Le Corbusier once suggested that architectural style was pretty, but no more so than a feather on a woman's hat. Deep down, though, fashion comes from the textile industry, which is central to everything. Modern economies are based on textiles. Textile weaving is the start of the Industrial Revolution. It's the birthplace of the digital world, because the industrialized weaving techniques are where digital technology came from. But it's also remarkably powerful as a cultural expression. So this is the imperial Japanese royal family around 1924. And the emperor and his eldest son dressed like English country gentlemen. What does it mean? Well, it meant at that time, Japan, which had actually threatened its citizens with death for even talking to foreigners as recently as 1850, had decided that when the Americans arrived and started to actually insist on opening the country up, they would have to modernize on the outside to stay the same on the inside pretty quickly. So at that moment, the way that the Japanese looked as modern as they could was to look as Western as they could. But 50 years later, once Japan had been through the post-war reconstruction and had moved from being a country which was once seen as China once was, a place which produced cheap copies of Western originals, this was the generation of Rei Kawakubo and Issey Miyake, who showed the world that Japan was a transmitter of ideas about fashion and not just a receiver of one. And to me that's one of the signs that a country which has a strong design culture can be at the center of things rather than being reduced to being just a consumer of them. One of my colleagues at the museum did try to explain to a 12-year-old what a typewriter is. It's quite a baffling object. This is one of the classics of design. Ettore Sottsass designed it for Olivetti. It was a wonderful example of design being used to turn an industrially produced piece of work equipment into something which was sold as a consumer object. Sottsass used to suggest that this was a typewriter designed to keep poets company on lonely country afternoons, and he designed it so the typewriter came in what's a bucket, so that you could actually sit on the bucket and type away. He saw it as being, I guess, an early form of emailing. And for Olivetti, it was a move into the consumer market. But back to that 12-year-old, my colleague at the museum explained to this very smart 12-year-old that a typewriter, of course, is something that you communicate with. And the kid said, yes, you mean it's a laptop that prints as soon as you type. And it's also, I think, the inspiration for another piece of much more recent, but equally now dead technology, the days when, well, the iMac was the product which was the first big thing that Jonathan Ive did for Apple. It was done when Steve Jobs came back from having been exiled by the company. And he actually took the same idea as Sottsass did, to use color to suggest that this thing that we associate with work is somehow something that you put on your desk to reflect how clever you are to buy one. And of course the technology of the cathode ray tube is astonishing. Again, this was meant to be portable. There's a sealed-in carrying thing at the top, but it weighs a ton. And I certainly wouldn't take it to the country to write poetry with. So, Buckminster Fuller, extraordinary man, who once very perceptively suggested that if you want, the best way to predict the future is to design it. And here he is with a geodesic dome and the Dymaxion car, which unfortunately on its launch at the Chicago World's Fair in 1934 killed a pedestrian, which did rather mar its efforts to become a successful car. But I think there's something in what Fuller said. It's idealistic. But also one has to say that even Steve Jobs, who just 11 years ago launched the smartphone, could not have predicted what his creation would do. He actually rather cheekily launched it by suggesting that it was part iPhone, part telephone, and part music playing device. And without that, of course, there would be no Amazon, which of course has destroyed not just so many of the objects that we use. I mean, the iPhone has, we don't need a camera, we don't need a wristwatch, we don't need a bookshop, we don't need a music player, we don't need a department store. Without the iPhone, there'll be no Uber, and Uber has utterly changed the way that many major cities get around. There would be no Tinder. I don't know if there's a Bulgarian Tinder, but clearly it's something which does change the way that people meet each other, fall in love. All of those things would not be possible without that one thing. And these are all effects that nobody had any idea of. And one has to say that these things are actually pushing us faster and faster. Jonathan Ive once told me that the original working prototype of the traditional telephone, copper wires, landlines, took 50 years to go from a working prototype to mass acceptance. And the fax machine probably took 12 years. And the tablet computer probably took 6 weeks to go from something which was unseen to becoming something that's overwhelmingly present. Grand Theft Auto 5, the questionable video game, sold 20 million copies in its first weekend. And there has never been a time in history when life has changed so quickly and so much. Think about contemporary China, which, when I first went there in 1992, Beijing airport had 12 gates. It looked like a bus station. I used to say like a Bulgarian bus station till I came to Bulgaria, so I don't say that anymore. And the road into town was a 2-lane blacktop. Now, of course, Beijing is one of the most dynamic and extraordinary cities in the world. So the question really facing us is, can the human race actually stand a pace of change that's quite so rapid? And what's it doing to us? Well, it's killing off that sense of the object that we had, and yet there's something also profoundly human about our need to relate to things. We want things that reflect who we are. We like the sense and the consolation of touch and tactile values. But what are the ones that survive? And I think the fountain pen is more or less dead. But the watch somehow, not just because of the cleverness of Swiss watch advertising, but the watch has somehow survived, even though it has no utilitarian purpose. You know, the function of a wristwatch is really a decorative thing, it's an alibi. But it's quite interesting that Apple chose the format of a watch for a small wearable computer. And you could say that, well, Apple has sold more of these every year than the entire Swiss watch industry, expensive and affordable, which could be seen as a threat. But actually, if I was Swiss, I would feel quite relieved, because for Apple to be doing this suggests that the watch has a continuing relevance into the future. But luxury is pretty weird in the digital world. It's pretty sad when people try and turn an artifact like this into something which is brandedly expensive. And yet, there is this hunger. We use objects as gifts. We use them, we like the idea of objects which show the passing of time. Going back to typewriters, my father actually gave me his typewriter, which when he did it, he thought would be a useful object. I wouldn't dream of giving my daughter my laptop. They don't grow old gracefully. So we're dealing with a world of augmented reality. This is the first example of AR that I've seen that actually seems useful. It's a collaboration between IKEA and Apple. And it does actually allow you not just to see what their catalogues pieces will look like in your room, but to see what it looks like from underneath and all around. We're seeing a world in which there is a growing gulf between the extremes. This is the Waymo. Google's attempted a car, which probably won't actually appear in this format, but is suggesting that we're rapidly coming to a time when the car will either be a self-driving autonomous vehicle like this, with which we will have a very different relationship. Even the most determined car enthusiast is going to find it very hard to have an emotional relationship with something that drives itself. And the chances are that you won't own it, that you won't need to have somewhere to park it, and that you will not be parking places when you go to the supermarket, because you will summon it, it will take you there, and then it will vanish again. And it also makes you think about how will these self-driving vehicles be designed. The driving experience will go, but they might be turned into a meeting room, or somewhere to have a drink with your friends, or somewhere to work, a travelling office. And the other side of the equation, of course, is this. I think there is a future at the luxury end of the market as well. The idea that the wealthy can use the car as a collector's piece. It's fascinating that Fiat Chrysler, which 5 years ago was the sole owner of Ferrari, floated it on the stock market, and Ferrari, which now makes 8,000 cars a year, has a stock market value which is pretty close to that of Fiat Chrysler, who make 4.5 million cars a year and have 300,000 employees, which is telling us that the market is saying mass market cars, they make the money out of the entertainment system, and a car like a Ferrari, which is still embodies those tactile qualities and values, which seems to be something that is part of what humans appreciate. They're made by craftsmen who will lovingly shape a clay model like this before the car is actually built. And I think you actually, when you look at those qualities, they start to become very much like the work of art. The way that Jeff Koons, who's the author of this piece, operates, to me seems very close to a design studio. Koons, of course, doesn't make this with his own hands. He doesn't draw the instructions which are used to fabricate it in a factory in the former East Germany. He has a studio full of assistants, and the way that you judge a work like this is pretty close to the way that you look at a Ferrari. Does it show any imperfections? What's it like when the light catches it? And it makes one reflect. There was a very interesting American economist called Thorsten Veblen, who wrote a book called The Theory of the Leisure Class in the late 19th, early 20th century. He was the first person to use the words conspicuous consumption, and he'd really nailed the fact that humans mostly live in pyramidal societies. At the top end of the pyramid are those who don't need to work, warriors, priests, aristocracy. In the middle are the merchant class, and at the bottom of this pyramid are those who work with their hands. And the society is based on putting a higher value on things which are not associated with physical labor. So it's the sign of the wealthy that they might wear white clothes. It's the sign of those who do not need to work that they might wear elaborate high-heeled shoes. There was a time in Northwest Europe when it was the sign of the wealthy that they had a suntan, which meant they could actually go to the south of France in the European winter. Now, of course, a suntan is a sign of those who don't know that it causes skin cancer, and it's a very different end of the social spectrum. And Veblen basically was making the point that the useless are the things that we value most. And that's certainly true of art, which is clearly useless, but is actually seen in the hierarchy as much more valuable than design, which carries that burden of being useful on some level. And you could see art now as taking the place of religion and magic in our world, now that we're becoming less reliant on our traditional faith. But I've always been fascinated also about how things are made. And at the museum, we are always trying to show that relationship between the designer, the maker, and the user. This is Jasper Morrison's air chair. It's made using technologies from the automotive industry. It actually forces gas through a mold to expand the plastic to do that. And to me, that's the most interesting moment in the chair's life. So going back to that thought about how the world is hollowing out, I see the future of, say, furniture, again, as being at one end of the spectrum, IKEA. And this is fascinating. I mean, IKEA's history is a remarkable one of trying to persuade the consumer that if they actually take part in the building process, they will get a rock-bottom price. But back in Sweden, they've now decided that people don't have the patience to use careful screwing and threading techniques. So they're now redesigning all their pieces to be as simple as possible. And this is the push-fit approach. And at the other end of the world is Mark Newson, who is notorious for having produced this limited edition piece, which was the first piece of furniture by a living designer to have sold at auction for more than $1 million. And here you start to think about, what is this design? Is it design in the traditional sense? I believe that design in the modern sense does come from mass production and that cut-off between the user and the maker. But this is going back to a time when craftsmen made most things, but every so often society would see a special object that needed something more than the craftsman. That's when the artist made a drawing for the craftsman to follow, and that's where the word design comes from. In French, dessin, in Italian, disegno. And you could say that this is actually returning to that moment, that design is being turned into a collector's piece and is collected very much in the way that art is, or Ferrari is. So the world has been turned upside down by those Silicon Valley oligarchs, the digital oligarchs, and Elon Musk, not content with having created PayPal, now is aiming to get to Mars while he's not trying to build the mass-produced Tesla. And he's actually already doing a few tests about how you might get to Mars. Again, this is in the context of the way that the world is speeding up. So not only do the oligarchs want to go to Mars, people like Dieter Thiel, one of Musk's collaborators on PayPal, an early investor in Uber, and the only Silicon Valley honcho to actually endorse Donald Trump, a man who put Gawker, the online magazine, out of business because he didn't like what they'd said about him, belongs to that generation of oligarchs who want to leave the common herd behind. So he's funding some studies into this project, which was meant to be a floating entity beyond the reach of the nation state, although you could say that Silicon Valley is already beyond the reach of the nation state. They pay taxes on a voluntary basis. And they also want to live to be 1,000. This guy is called Aubrey de Grey, who runs an institute in California which is trying to create what he calls minimal impact old age. Although, to judge by the look of him, he's not going to make it to be 1,000. And we're seeing very rapid changes in technology. This is, of course, robotic digital fabrication, which the last time I saw Nicholas Negroponte give a talk, he was saying that this is now so over, and what's next is bioengineering. He could be right. And of course, we are facing terrible problems in the world. And I think we are looking at a generation of designers who are not terribly interested in making another lemon squeezer, but are looking back to a generation like Victor Papanek, who once, in one of his more inflammatory essays, suggested that there are a few professions more dangerous than industrial design, but not many, which is, I think, it's a bit harsh. But that is certainly the case, that designers are now interested in asking questions rather than necessarily always answering them, that they're trying to reinterpret design in the way perhaps that the Italian radicals of the 1960s and 70s did. They acknowledge that industrial design does come from the market, and yet they're now trying to use design to bite the hand that once fed them. We're actually now dealing with this plastic horror, that the world is disappearing into this mountain of waste and litter. Can new techniques be used to make a water container possible, perhaps, which you might eat? So I've gone through what I thought design might be. I've looked a bit about the future. And now, if you'll bear with me, I want to talk a little bit about what design is doing in a museum. This is the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, which has a claim to be regarded as the first museum of design anywhere. And it was created by a remarkable English civil servant called Henry Cole, who also staged the world's first expo in 1851, which was the Great Exhibition, which was a remarkable project. It was a huge cast iron and glass building, which really invented high-tech architecture. 5 million people went to see it in the course of a year. It made a profit. But it actually did divide British culture at that time. William Morris, the revolutionary socialist wallpaper designer, was taken there by his mother as a birthday treat, and he refused to go inside on the basis that everything inside it would be machine-made and therefore ugly. After the fair, Cole persuaded the British government to start the Victoria and Albert Museum, whose original purpose was to show manufacturers how they might make products that would compete more effectively with their Austro-Hungarian, Prussian and French competitors, which would actually teach students how you might design, which would teach the public what good, quote-unquote, design was. In fact, Cole, the first selection of exhibits all came from the expo, and he also had what he called the Black Museum, where he showed examples of what he said was bad design, which was making things try and look things like they weren't. And he had the grace to admit, of course, that the bad design museum was the most popular with the public. And having started this museum, after Cole departed, of course, given the nature of that hierarchy which I described earlier, which sees design as somehow commercial and art as something which is somehow more pure, subsequent directors of the Victoria and Albert Museum turned it from a museum of the future and mass production into an exquisite museum of decorative arts, which has wonderful things from all around the world, including Raphael cartoons and Korean celadon vases from the 5th century and silverware and glass, but nothing mass-produced. And it wasn't really until the Design Museum's founder, Terence Conran, set up a prototype project inside this museum that they'd even shown a car inside it. The V&A is now a very different place. I think it's actually has embraced the idea of design as being how you interpret what happens next. But it was an important social shift. And you could say that the second example of a major museum that shows design as part of it was the Museum of Modern Art in New York, founded in the 1930s. And there, contemporary architecture and design were allowed into the museum, but only if the curators pretended it was actually art. So they would bring in ball bearings, which would be described as a piece of sculpture. Again, MoMA is a different place now, but that was the second model of how you might actually show design in a museum. And then around the same time the Design Museum started, there was a kind of epidemic of people starting museums. This was Frank Gehry's project for Vitra, which is in some ways seen as being a company design museum. It's not about Vitra, it's about a remarkable collection of furniture, and it's about design as well. But my colleagues at Vitra do sometimes worry that right next to them is a Herzog and de Meuron designed showroom for Vitra products, which show all the classics like Charles and Ray Eames's work and Alto, and it's all shiny, new and free. And inside this, sometimes say that their audience is expected to pay to see museum quality pieces of Charles Eames, which of course are scratched, dirty and old, but therefore much more valuable than new ones, which have been made yesterday. And then there was us. After the initial experiment of Conran had of putting the museum into the V&A, he then found what was once a banana ripening warehouse by the Thames, just by Tower Bridge, and this was it. His architects turned it into a miniature Bauhaus, hence all the white walls and the flat roof. And that was a kind of statement at the time. In those days, as I've said, the story of design was a question of chairs and good taste, and that sense of design was about teaching designers how to make the world a better place, and it was very didactic and had a moral quality. And that strand is still part of what we do, but I think now we have a much wider platform which looks at other things too. And as I said, we moved into our new home. I was hired with a brief to find somewhere bigger and better, to move from a building of 3,000 square meters to 10,000 square meters. It took us a while to find it. Initially we were going to build something new right behind Tate Modern. And we thought initially that would be great because 5 million people every year go to Tate Modern, and of course they'd march past our front door and come in and buy tickets with us. And then, well, actually, maybe they won't. Maybe it's a much bigger place than we are, and maybe we should go somewhere else. And we looked at going back to the Victoria and Albert Museum, and then finally we were offered this building, which was built in 1962. It's got a great history. It was originally built as the Commonwealth Institute, which replaced an earlier building, which was called the Imperial Institute, which is a reminder that Britain once had an empire. And in its first incarnation, right next to the Victoria and Albert, the Imperial Institute was about showing the wonders of Malayan rubber and bauxite. And by 1962, of course, the very name Imperial was seen as seriously bad news. So it was renamed the Commonwealth, and this rather splendid Victorian building in which it sat was demolished, creating the start of the first conservationist movement in Britain. People suddenly said, we've got to keep these buildings. And the creation of what in its time was seen as remarkably daring concrete roofed structure. And inside it was like a little bit like a permanent World's Fair. Each country had its own permanent display. Australia had one of those diorama which explained the finer points of sheep shearing. Sri Lanka regrettably shot and stuffed a tiger for theirs. Canada had an Inuit totem pole and a snowmobile. But like many things of that period, these utopian dreams had roofs that leaked furiously and were very hard to heat and upkeep, and eventually the Commonwealth moved out and they left this landmark structure which couldn't be demolished without consent, and we offered it. And we worked with the architect John Pawson to turn it into our home. And for me, museums have a future because they are mainly a social experience. They are a reason to turn your screen off and go and do something with other people. So it's designed to be a very welcoming, inviting place. It's a great place for a party. And being not a state-funded museum, but a charity, we need to be very careful about how we support ourselves. Every year we need to raise £10 million to run our programme, and the government gives us 200,000. So you can see that we have to work hard. So we have a shop, or 2 shops. When I was a journalist, I used to think that museum shops were the work of the devil. Now I know exactly how useful they are, because the wide public actually understands what a shop is, and it's a way that you seduce people in. And so long as your shop has the same values as the rest of your offer, then it's fine, and needs to constantly change what it's offering and not actually condescend and not sell people rubbish. But and we, for the first time, are able to offer a permanent display, which is about this theme, designer, maker, and user, which I talked about. And we began by inviting our audience before we opened to nominate objects which they thought should be in display in a museum of design. And here they are displayed beautifully. And I guess the point of this is not really to say that these objects themselves are so extraordinary, but displaying them here like exhibits in a museum, beautifully impaled on the wall, is actually suggesting that if you actually study any object and examine it carefully enough, you will learn something really interesting about the person who owned it, the person who designed it, how it's made, how it's used. Think about the Walkman, for example, which is one of, on one hand, Sony's great breakthrough that they actually started to sell people a tape recorder that didn't record, but it was also the start of that movement of actually people increasingly isolating themselves with headphones from the world around them. And if you also think back to those early generation Walkmans, they came with headphones that had orange sponge pieces for your ears, which obviously were a piece of jewellery as much as they were about sound quality. And we have this, as I say, we have a few words, a bit of history, but not much. But actually I was surprised. People actually stand and read these words, and they walk straight past the video screen behind it, which does suggest that people are quite interested and hungry for information. And in it we have all sorts of versions of design. So we've got 3D printers, we've got the first tonnet chair, and as I said, we're interested in making, so it shows not just the chair, but the press which tortures the bent wood into the right shape. We show the generations of classic industrial design, Apple, Braun, Sony, Olivetti, some very nice graphics. You can't quite see it because it's out of focus, but on the top of that is the first version of the Apple trademark, which was a wood engraving of Newton under the apple tree, but done in the manner of a Californian folk rock album cover, and it quite quickly dropped it. And as I say, we like to make things, so that sheet of yellow is the leftovers from tennis ball manufacturing. And here we have the classic useless designer object, Philippe Starck's lemon squeezer, which is not the best way to make lemon juice, but actually it's not about that. It's designed as a gift. But to me, much more interesting than the object is what makes the object. You know, I think that there is an argument to say that until you know how to make something, you can't really say that you've designed it. That's our founder's, Terence Conran's words. I did hear Vico Magistretti, the great Italian designer no longer with us, suggested somewhat differently that unless you can clarify your thinking about a design so clearly that you can describe it over a telephone, then you haven't designed it properly. And in addition to our collection, we have a changing exhibitions program. We do about 6 exhibitions a year. These we do charge for. This was our opening show. And opening a design museum is quite a statement, so you do need to say something about the territory you're exploring and investigating. And the title here, Fear and Love, is somehow a reminder of previous versions of the Design Museum. When the museum opened in its Victoria and Albert pop-up stage back in '83, the opening exhibition was called Art and Industry. When we opened in Shad Thames, our white Bauhaus building, the first show was called Culture and Commerce. And here the chief curator called his exhibition Fear and Love. And what he did was to ask about a dozen architects, designers from around the world to explore some aspects of the world around us which are causing them concern in as far as the designer can impact on it, and create an installation which reflects on that. So it was about a geographical spread of design that we'd not had before. We looked at China, we looked at Japan, we looked at the rest of Europe and America, because I see design as being something which is entirely without borders. We're not a museum of British design. It's hard to say what British design is. Jonathan Ive was born in Britain, it's true, but on the box from Apple it says designed in California, and the object is made in Shenzhen, in a Taiwanese-owned factory, with components that come from 11 different countries in the world. Is that American design? Is that British design? Is it relevant? You can see ways in which design is used to suggest things about national characteristics in the way that I described for banknotes or even cars, but design is borderless. So Fear and Love took us from the Dutch group Metahaven, which was exploring the Japanese insistence on continuing the whaling that they do in the name of scientific research. Actually, it's to eat them. And contrasting this with the way that the largest and most intelligent living being on the planet, apart from mankind, arguably, is being hunted to death, and we're trying to create robotic machines that have empathy. This was by a Dutch designer, Christian Miedsmeit, which is about fast fashion and how wasteful it is. One of the reasons that you can't recycle fashion textiles is that it's very hard to know actually what is inside the garments, which are labelled pure wool, but usually aren't. So she actually started the project by buying 60, 70 samples of woolen garments from around the supermarkets and having them analysed to see what was actually in them as opposed to what it said on the label, and then creating this rather beautiful installation to say that if you actually could sort out the textiles more effectively, then you could do something quite beautiful. And this is Neri Oxman, a woman researcher at MIT, who has been taking 3D printing to extraordinary, complicated levels, and starting to suggest that these are actually on the edge of becoming organic, that you could start to think about one day printing a nervous system, and on another level you could understand them as being death masks. And this was the installation which OMA, the Rotterdam architects, did, which they called a living room for Europe. And you'll remember that the museum opened shortly after the British took the completely mad decision to leave the European Union. And this was a room which is furnished with a piece of furniture from every member state To be honest, I can't remember which one came from Hungary, but the foam was from Slovenia. And on the back was a Venetian blind, which was finished in the colours of all the European flags, except red, white and blue, which as you can see is lying on the floor. And the British contribution was the wallpaper on the right, which came from the Chancellor of the Exchequer, George Osborne's family wallpaper business. And then our second show was about California, not in the traditional sense of mid-century modern, the case study houses and Charles Ray Eames, but it was really looking at how that generation who would once have called themselves hippies, who went to India in search of enlightenment, who took too many drugs, came home and started some of the most valuable companies on the planet. And here, this kind of nice idea about the word California, we think of as meaning freedom. So that's the 60s version of the Easy Rider Harley that Peter Fonda rode in Easy Rider. And on the right is the self-driving car. And then we do look at history. So we had a quick look at the traditional idea, well, looking at how architecture and politics and power coincided with the way that Moscow was rebuilt as the capital of the Soviet Union after the revolution, when the government left St. Petersburg, and Stalin and those around him set out to create Moscow as the world capital of socialism. I have to confess I have a particular fascination for the work of Boris Yofan, who was responsible for the design of the Palace of the Soviets, and it's an amazing example of how architecture and power reflect each other. So Stalin dynamited the largest church in the Soviet Union to make way for the Palace of the Soviets, which was going to be the world's tallest building by far. They got as far as the 11th floor, then the Germans arrived, but it was going to be taller than the Empire State Building, topped by a statue of Lenin pointing at the Kremlin, which would have been taller than the Statue of Liberty. They weren't messing around. And it's actually tragic because Yofan was quite an interesting architect who, I suppose, sacrificed himself to Stalin for the chance to build this monstrous object. And of course, after the war, Stalin played around with completing it, but never did. And when Khrushchev came to power and made his famous speech denouncing Stalin's politics and his architecture, he turned the foundations of this into Moscow's largest open-air swimming pool. And then, of course, in the days of ex-Soviet Union and the new Russia, the cathedral that Stalin blew up was rebuilt stone by stone with a car park underneath it. Every year we do a show which is called Designs of the Year. We ask 60 or 70 people from around the world to nominate objects, which we then bring to an exhibition. We have a jury which nominates in each category the most interesting thing they see in that year. It's fascinating to reflect on what wins and what doesn't. In the first year, the award went to Shepard Fairey's Obama Hope poster, which has rather shaped the exhibition we got on at the moment about politics and graphics, which is called Hope to Nope, which starts with Obama and ends with Trump. But we've missed a few things. The iPhone, for example, was nominated, but we thought it was just a big telephone with no buttons. And we sometimes work with individual designers to do exhibitions, although there's a marked reluctance, I find, among designers to do retrospectives of their work. So we asked Helle Jongerius, the very gifted Dutch designer, to do a show about her work, and she said no, but I'll do a show about colour. This is and I think she's fascinating in that the essence of the project was really her sadness about what industrially produced colour has robbed us of, because we go for Pantone colours because it's about consistency and about predictability. But for her, of course, colour is special if it is special, and that you actually have qualities which are not scientific and precise. And she does value that sense of imperfection. Making something perfect is technically difficult, but conceptually pretty simple. Whereas imperfection asks you to think about things all the time, which I find really interesting as an idea. And this is an exhibition about the British fashion designer, Paul Smith. We installed his studio in the museum, partly to prove to the staff that I don't have the untidiest office in the whole of Western Europe. And this is now touring the world. We're quite keen that we take the message outside, so this is opening in Beijing in China next month. And this is that shop which I mentioned. And, you know, I talked earlier before about how the museum is a place which is about the social aspects of life, that we actually do go there as a shared experience. But you also have to talk to a digital audience as well. So this is our home page, and we communicate with our audiences through Instagram, of course, and through Twitter. We have 4.5 million Twitter followers, which is the third highest of any museum in the world. I'm not quite sure what they get out of the tweeting. I have someone who tweets for me, don't do it myself. But it is, I think, important that you can now blend the physical experience of a museum with that digital one. And that's it. So I hope you think that's some of the futures of design. Thank you for coming. No one left. No one's asked for their money back yet.